Welcome to the next video in the evolution series. This video will be looking at 2 dot points from the Evolution of Australian Biota topic, 8.5.27, discuss Darwin's observations of Australian flora and fauna and relate these to his theory of evolution, and 8.5.26, discuss current theories that provide a model to account for these changes. So over the last couple of videos, we've been looking at changes in vegetation and other species of Australian organisms as a result of the movement of Australia north once it separated from Antarctica. And what we're going to do now is have a look at what Darwin saw when he came to Australia and how he tried to explain what was going on using his theory of evolution. So Darwin's voyage in the ship the Beagle from 1831 to 1836 took him many places, including South America, the Galapagos Islands, and Australia. He briefly visited Australia, stopping in Sydney, Hobart, and King George's Sound in Western Australia. During his 18-day stop-off in Sydney, he journeyed to Bathurst. He is reported to have described the land beyond Sydney as arid and sterile, and the flora as unappealing. In Hobart, he collected specimens of flora, fauna, rocks, and fossils. In Western Australia, he collected shells, barnacles, 10 species of fish, and 66 specimens of insects, many of which were previously unknown to the English. His visit to Australia was towards the end of his journey, when he was keen to return to England. His observation of our flora, fauna, landscape, and people feature in his writings. In particular, he speculated about the relationship between our flora and fauna and those elsewhere. Darwin not only noted the uniqueness of the Australian biota, such as the monotremes and marsupials, he also noted the similarities with flora and fauna from other parts of the world he had visited. He noted similarities between unrelated organisms, such as marsupials and placentals from other parts of the world. Marsupials and placentals that live in similar environments and have similar ways of life, which we call niches, resemble each other structurally and physiologically. This similarity in unrelated animals, which is known as convergence, supports Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Darwin tried to explain the similarities and differences, which we now know as variations, that he observed. He believed that rather than similar creatures being created independently, they could arise from a common ancestor, accounting for basically similar organisms changing or becoming different. He also suggested that organisms that started off distantly related but were subjected to similar environments could evolve similar features. So some examples of similarities between unrelated animals that Darwin made were the flying squirrel or placentals from North America, Eurasia, and Africa, and he compared these to Australia's glider possums, which we know are marsupials. So these are unrelated mammalian orders that have converged by evolving specialized loose skin flaps for gliding. So because of the environment that they live in, being able to glide between tree to tree allows them to avoid predators. So this is something that they have evolved over time, even though they've lived in completely different areas. Then we can also have a look at deer, antelope, and sheep, which are placentals, and compare them to the kangaroos of Australia, which we know also are marsupials. And these occupy similar niches and have similar digestive physiologies, but as we can see, outwardly they look completely different. So they have different morphologies. So remember, physiology or physiological adaptation is something towards the inside that we cannot visibly see quite easily. And morphology is the way that the animal is put together. So Darwin made numerous observations, including these examples of the fact that similar environments in completely different parts of the world seem to be inhabited by animals having similar adaptations, but obviously belonging to different species. Observation forced him to discard the idea of fixed, unchanging species, and Darwin set out to find an explanation for these observations. So that's where the theory of natural selection came through. So the theory of evolution by natural selection depends on 3 main factors. So as we know, life has been on Earth for a very long time. Changes in a population may take millions of years or may have occurred much more quickly. There is variation between members of the same species, and there is an immense variety of environments and habitats on Earth. So those 3 things interacting with one another mean that variation allows those organisms that live in different environments to adapt to be better suited to those different environments and habitats. So what about some theories that provide models for change? So the theory of continental drift provides one model to explain Australia's climate changes. Climate changes, and therefore changes to the environment, have changed the distribution and abundance of species. The theory of natural selection helps to explain how some species survive and adapt to changes in the environment. And the theory of adaptive radiation helps explain how species can spread out and eventually diversify into different species that occupy different habitats. Adaptive radiation, or divergent evolution, has been extensively applied to explain the changes that occurred in the flora and fauna of Australia as it became hotter and drier. We can see in this picture here, this shows the adaptive radiation of the Galapagos finches. So these finches are also sometimes referred to as Darwin's finches. So when Darwin spent time at the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that there was a number of different types of birds that all looked very similar. However, because of the different food that was available on each of the islands, which is indicated by this purple part of the circle, they had adapted themselves to have different beak shapes. So this allowed those particular birds the variations that occurred in those individuals on those particular islands allowed them to eat more and therefore obviously survive to reproductive age and pass that characteristic on to their offspring. And gradually over time, what's actually happened with the Galapagos finches is they've become so different from one another that they no longer are the same species. We now have all these multiple species of birds that live in a very small area in the Galapagos Islands. However, because they've become isolated from each other and adapted to their particular areas, they're no longer able to interbreed with one another. So what you'll be doing as well is looking at dot point 8.5.2d, which is present information from secondary sources to discuss the Huxley-Wilberforce debate on Darwin's theory of evolution. So as we know, people weren't really happy with Darwin's theory of evolution and that humans were possibly or have possibly evolved from apes. And during 1860, there was a public debate held between the religious people. So where are we? So So the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, debated with Huxley, so Thomas Huxley, who was a biologist who took the side of Darwin at this time because he was at the point where he was getting to the end of his time. He wasn't well enough to be able to travel and to be able to front up to these debates. So you'll be having a look at the Huxley-Wilberforce debate in class and what sort of came out of that and what the different opinions were and why it was so famous in the ideas behind evolution. And that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you for watching.